Good day. Again today in this program, I'm going to try to discuss or focus on the visit of the Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow and discuss the implications of this meeting. I will say that I'm going to have to return to this topic in my next video as well, because apparently two important joint statements have been signed by the leaders of China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Putin. But so far, I've not been able to obtain up-to-date texts of these two statements. That what I'm seeing in the Russian and Chinese media about them is interesting. Anyway, I'll come back to that later in the program. Before I discuss, firstly, the situation, the military situation in Ukraine, an interesting article I've been provided about Russian arms, shell production, and then, as I said, I'm going to come to the topic of the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. So let's first of all begin with the military situation on the ground in Ukraine, which is now, as I've said many times, the traditional starting point of programs on this channel. Now, the very first thing to say is that the first news, the big news that one got this morning, is that both the Russians and the Ukrainians have launched missile and drone attacks on each other's territories. Now, I say both sides, but of course it is only the Russians who have launched missile attacks, and these have been concentrated apparently on an airbase near Odessa, where the drone attack that was launched against the railway station at Jankoy apparently originated from. But apparently there have also been other Russian missile and drone strikes in other parts of Ukraine as well. Now, to be very clear, this was not one of those big Russian drone and missile strikes. We're not talking about scores of missiles, and I'm not going to try to give an estimate as to the damage done as a result of this particular Russian strike. As I said, the Russians are saying that it was a retaliatory strike for the earlier Ukrainian drone strike, and I've no reason on this occasion to doubt that. The Ukrainians, for their part, launched further drone attacks, this time on Sevastopol. These were attacks by drones, both drones that operate by air, and apparently also a seaborne drone, and apparently the target again was Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Russians claim that all of the drones were shot down in the case of the air-launched drones, or intercepted in case of the seaborne drones, so that this entire operation apparently was a failure. And the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has now decorated two Russian soldiers who were operating some of the air defense equipment that the Russians say shot down these drones. And interestingly, both of them were women, which of course is consistent with what often happens in war. I can remember that during the Second World War, both in Britain and Germany, and indeed in the Soviet Union as well, many of the personnel that operated the anti-aircraft guns that protected those countries during that war were in fact women. And it looks like the same is true in this conflict as well. Anyway, the Russians say that this drone attack on Sevastopol was a complete failure. Again, I have no reason to doubt this. All the indications suggest that the Russians are telling the truth about this. If they are not, then I expect to see some satellite confirmation before long. And by the way, I'm still waiting for satellite confirmation to either confirm or refute the Ukrainian claims about some kind of devastating attack on a train at the Jankoy station, carrying Kalibr missiles. The Russian channels all unanimously denied that this was the case, and so far I've seen no evidence either to confirm or refute their denials. Anyway, that was one piece of news. Now, there's been lots of discussion and some information about the situation on the battlefronts, with the major emphasis being given on the fighting in Bakhmut and also on the fighting in Avdeevka. Now, the British Ministry of Defence has published one of its latest intelligence updates, and it says that there seems to be some sign of a loss of momentum on the part of the Russian offensive in Bakhmut. And I've noticed that some people, Bernhardt, for example, at the Moon of Alabama, also seems to take the same view. He says that over the last 3 days, there's been less information about what is going on in Bakhmut. Now, these reports from the British Ministry of Defence and on the Moon of Alabama came out simultaneously with a cluster of reports from Russian channels claiming that the Russians in Bakhmut itself have now fully captured the territory of the giant Azov factory. Now, a short time afterwards, the well-known Russian military commentator and reporter Yuri Podolyaka came out and said that this is not quite the case, that there are still Ukrainians are still holding out in some parts of this factory, and that claims that the entire factory has been captured by the Russians are premature. There's uncertainty about this issue, but anyway, there doesn't seem to be any doubt that the major fighting in Bakhmut at the moment is taking place within Bakhmut. There is also pressure from the two pincer forces, the northern one, which is pressing towards Homovo, which sits astride one of the main roads leading into Bakhmut, and the southern one pushing towards Ivanivska. But it's clear that the roads, the asphalt roads leading into Bakhmut, remain to all intents and purposes unusable for the moment by the Ukrainian military. And in fact, we've had claims to that effect from Yan Gagin, and this is what the advisor of Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk government, Russian-appointed Donetsk government, and this is the TASS report on what he said. Artyomovsk, called Bakhmut in Ukraine, has been fully sealed off by Russian forces, and all approaches to the city are under artillery control. Yan Gagin, military political expert and advisor to the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, said on Wednesday. The city is in operational encirclement, which means that all the approaches and all the transportation arteries leading to it are under the control of our artillery. In principle, it can be said that the city has been actually sealed off. And TASS also reports Gagin as saying, over the course of this interview, that the Ukrainian garrison inside the city, which is now trapped, numbers around 10,000 men. Now, there's also been some reports that I've seen on Russian Telegram channels, including, by the way, Slavyangrad, that over the course of this same interview on Russia 1 television channel, Gagin also said that Ukraine has failed to organize an effective counterattack to break the siege of Bakhmut. Now, I don't know whether that's the case or not, and it may be that Gagin is being a little ahead of himself in saying that. it's still possible, it seems to me, that Ukraine might launch such a counterattack over the course of the next couple of days. We'll just have to wait and see. But certainly, I'm getting reports, and they were to some extent confirmed, but to a great extent confirmed, yesterday on the Duran by Dima of the Military Summary Channel, who joined us for a live stream and is one of the most astute and authoritative commentators of the fighting in Ukraine. Anyway, Dima also said that the counterattack has failed to take place, and he says the reason is the enormously difficult weather conditions, the swampy soil, which is making a counterattack extremely difficult for Ukraine to organize at this time. Well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens, what the Ukrainians do, and whether such a counterattack takes place, and if it does take place, whether it takes place in time. All the indications are that the Russians are still gaining ground inside Bakhmut. And if it is correct that there are 10,000 Ukrainian troops inside Bakhmut, trapped and cut off, unable to retreat because doing so would expose them to heavy shelling by the Russian artillery, which are now able to cover the entire exit corridor, unable to gain much in the way of reinforcement, but perhaps still clinging on in the desperate hope that Ukrainian forces further west will come eventually to their rescue. Well, it is not surprising in that case that the fighting within Bakhmut is very intense, and that the Russians, whilst making progress, are having to make that progress against intense Ukrainian opposition. Now, there have been various maps circulating about the situation inside Bakhmut and in the areas around abouts. They seem to suggest that that Ukrainian counterattack against the southern pincer, the one that allegedly pushed the Russians some distance back from the road that passes through Ivanivska, that it's been reversed again, that the Russians have once again come closer to the road, that they're again close to Ivanivska itself. I suspect that there is an awful lot of ebb and flow going on in various fights, small battles that take place along these roads. But perhaps the Russian calculation is that with their artillery able to cover these roads, it makes little sense for them to commit more forces and expend more lives actually physically capturing these two villages, specifically Ivanivska. Khromovo might be a different matter, against intense Ukrainian resistance, given, as I said, that the roads are, as Jan Gagin says, effectively cut off from use anyway. Anyway, this remains a complex and difficult battle. It's clear that the Russians haven't fully consolidated a perimeter around Bakhmut. It's likely that the fighting there will continue for some time, and we'll see what happens. Now, what about that British claim that the Russians might have lost momentum? And I'm not going to discuss that aspect of it. I think I've already discussed that. But the British say that one reason why the Russian attack on Bakhmut might have slowed down is because the Russians might have, this is all very qualified, might have redeployed forces to other areas, to other battlefield areas. And which forces and what other battlefield areas? Well, if we're talking about the Wagner organization, which has been spearheading the fight for Bakhmut, it seems that it has been mostly focused, those of its forces that are not fighting in Bakhmut itself, have been mostly focused on this advance towards Orekhovo-Vasilievka, which is located some distance towards the north. Apparently this village, as I've said previously, has been taken into a pincer envelopment, but the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to this village, which is very important, and there's been heavy shelling of the Russian forces that are advancing on this village. So it could be that this is the redeployment of forces that the British Defence Ministry is talking about. That is, of course, assuming that they have any information, any actual information about the situation in and around Bakhmut at all, which is different from the open source information that is accessible to me as well. Anyway, that's one. As I said, these comments are very, very very tentative, very heavily qualified from what the British Ministry of Defence is saying. And there is one other possibility, and it's one that occurred to me. I'm not sure that this is true. I may be completely wrong here, but it does take me back to Prigozhin's complaints over the last few weeks about the fact that his forces have not been getting all the ammunition that they need. Now, after Prigozhin started to make all those statements, what we saw is a major Russian advance further south around the town of Avdeevka, which is, of course, located close to Donetsk city. And it looks as if the Russians are now working very hard towards fully encircling Avdeevka. And in fact, over the last few hours, there are more reports of further Russian advances in the Avdeevka area and of the Russians steadily now tightening their grip around this particular town. And yesterday, in that same live stream, which we had with Dima from the Military Summary channel, Dima mentioned the fact that Ukraine is very, very short of reserves in this area. Reserves have been concentrated around Bakhmut, and there is a lack of reserve units able, therefore, to repel these Russian advances in Avdeevka. Now, I wonder whether what might have happened is that the Russian High Command, perhaps it didn't exactly reduce, but it prioritized shell supply not to Prigozhin and his Wagner troops fighting in Bakhmut, but to the First Corps of the militia of the Donetsk Republic, which has been carrying out this envelopment of Avdeevka. This is purely a guess. I can't confirm it, but note that the Russians appear to be engaging in two offensives, in Bakhmut and in Avdeevka, simultaneously. And that must be using up an awful lot of ammunition, and it may be that there's been some juggling going on. And that might be why Prigozhin got somewhat upset. He might be worried, both that he's not getting as much ammunition as he would like, but also perhaps he might be worried that some of the emphasis is going to switch from the Wagner forces, of which, by the way, he is justifiably extremely proud, that the focus might start to switch towards the Donbass forces that are enveloping Avdeevka. And I'm going to say something. I think he might actually have a point. I'm not saying that this point, if he is the one that he has, is correct, but it does seem to me again that just as I felt in the summer when the Russians let off pressure on Bakhmut, this is in August of last year, they relaxed some of the pressure that they were directing against Bakhmut and concentrated instead on capturing a fortified village near Donetsk city, the village of Pesky, which was the first important fortified position around Donetsk to fall. It does make me wonder whether again the Russians might be, well, I'm not going to say that they're reducing pressure on Bakhmut this time, but perhaps that pressure might not be as intense as it could have been, because instead they've chosen to conduct this attack on Avdeevka simultaneously. Now let me emphasize again, this is pure speculation on my part, but it is interesting that the Russians are conducting these two offensives at one and the same time. Now, the capture of Avdeevka would be as strategically important as the capture of Bakhmut. Yesterday, again on our live stream, Dima of the Military Summary Channel explained that the fall of Avdeevka would not only significantly relieve pressure on Donetsk city, which would have huge symbolical and psychological importance for the population of Donetsk city, which has had to endure siege conditions and steady shelling from Ukrainian troops based in Avdeevka and its environs ever since 2014. But it would also open the way for a further Russian advance towards a town called Pokrovsk, which is another one of these important base positions that Ukraine has created behind the front lines. So one can understand why the Russians would want to advance in Avdeevka, why they would be interested in capturing Avdeevka. And no doubt they calculate that they do have the resources to take both places, Bakhmut and Avdeevka, at one and the same time. But I can imagine, I have no difficulty seeing how this decision to engage in simultaneous assaults like this might create some tensions on the part of Russian commanders who might feel, in the case of Prigozhin, well, he's not actually the commander, but he acts as if he was, and as I said, he's an effective spokesman for the Wagner organization, of which, as I said, he's justifiably proud. Anyway, that it might create tensions between the commanders in ways that we have seen happen in many wars. Now, if you're a Briton or an American, you would, of course, remember, for example, the case of the rivalry between Montgomery and Patton during the Second World War. And juggling responsibilities between commanders is not unusual in war, and it's sometimes something that general staffs and overall commanders have to do. And sometimes, by the way, they can work it in a way that is to the advantage of in executing the overall plan. Anyway, I just throw out these ideas. We'll see what happens. We'll see if there is a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut. We'll see whether, on the contrary, as the evidence suggests, the Russians who gain control of Bakhmut, and as a young Gagin seems confident, increasingly confident, that this Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut isn't going to take place. Well, we'll see whether or not he is right. But anyway, we will see whether or not there is going to be a possibility of a further Russian advance in this area or a Russian counterattack. One way or the other, the situation remains somewhat uncertain. Now, there's lots of things going on in other parts of the battlefronts. There seems to be a more quiet situation for the moment in Zaporozhye region, where the Ukrainians launched all those reconnaissances in force which I discussed in my previous video, without much success. There's also been further reports of Ukrainians and Russians continuing to fight intensively in the Kupiansk area. Some reports that the Russians are making more headway around Kupiansk, but information is very scant, and I'm not going to say much more about it. Now, yesterday, the big news, at least on the Russian side, about the war, was not about the situation on the battlefronts. It was about the British decision to supply Ukraine with depleted uranium shells, which most probably, in fact, unquestionably, will be supplied along with the Challenger 2 tanks that Britain is supplying to Ukraine. And I've had a deluge of emails from all sorts of people explaining to me how these depleted uranium shells work, how they basically create a kind of extremely heavy dart that is able to penetrate, or is planned to penetrate, the armor plate of tanks, armored vehicles that these shells are launched against. But there's no doubt at all, there's overwhelming consensus about the toxicity of these particular shells, depleted uranium shells. And the Russians are deeply angered, and I think generally angered and upset about this. There's been lots of comments about how this is another red line that the Western powers are crossing. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has actually made a comment to that effect. He said that the Western powers pass one red line after another, and there are fewer and fewer of them now left, which is rather an ominous statement, and one wonders what it would lead to. And there's even been comments that this is in effect the equivalent of sending a dirty bomb to Ukraine because of the extreme toxicity of these shells. Toxicity which apparently can also affect the tank crews that would be using them. At least that's what I've seen claimed. And it seems that there are alternatives to using these depleted uranium darts, if you like, launched from tank guns. It's been suggested that tungsten, a rare metal, or at least a metal that's not available in large quantities, can fulfill the same role without any of the same levels of toxicity. But it is a case that, in fact, in the West, tungsten is not produced in any significant quantities. The biggest producers at the moment appear to be China, Vietnam, and Russia. So I don't know whether the Russians, by the way, use tungsten for their own, as I said, darts, big tank darts. Perhaps they do. But anyway, the Russians have taken very badly to this news. And inevitably, there's comments, including a comment that I made over the course of yesterday's live stream with Dima of the Military Summary Channel on the Duran, that it did seem paradoxical that after all the complaints, all the assertions, all the criticisms and predictions that the Russians might might use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, might engage in use of dirty bombs in Ukraine and that sort of thing, that the first byproduct, and should be said, byproduct of the nuclear industry that's actually been used on the Ukrainian battlefields has been supplied or is going to be supplied to Ukraine by the British. Anyway, I don't know what the Russians are going to do in response. They say that their latest tanks, the T-90M, the updated T-80s and T-72s that form the spearhead of their tank forces, that they have protection devices that are designed to protect them from these kind of depleted uranium shells, and that they would not be effective in use on the battlefields. And I've also seen a Russian report which says that Russian shells, that there are Russian shells, perhaps using tungsten darts, I'm not certain about this, just a guess, that actually have better penetration than these British shells that the Ukrainians are going to be provided with. But anyway, this brings me to the topic of shells, and specifically Russian production of shells. And I'm going to say that yesterday I received a private video from a friend of mine, somebody who runs his own channel. I'm not going to disclose it because I said it is a private, it was a private email, but he'll know who it is, and we can no doubt disclose that fairly soon. But anyway, this particular person provided me with an article from the Jamestown Institute, an interesting organization in itself, by the way, one which has, shall we say, political biases and views on geopolitical topics that are diametrically opposite to mine, and which is based, I believe, in the United States. But anyway, there was an interesting article in the provided by the Jamestown Institute about Russian shell production. Now, the reason I found this article interesting is it doesn't actually tell us anything that I think is really useful about Russian shell production. But I suspect it does provide us with an insight, not on the topic of Russian shell production, but on the way in which analysts in the West, especially I suspect, and increasingly in Western intelligence agencies, approach this topic. And I'm going to suggest that if that is right, then it goes very far to explain why the West gets so many things about Russia, about the state of its economy, the state of its finances, the state of its military, the state of its industrial production capacity, so radically and completely wrong. Now, I must qualify that. I'm not suggesting in any way that the author of this article has any connection with Western intelligence agencies, and I should say that his name suggests an East European provenance, which perhaps makes that unlikely. But I do suspect, as I said, that the methodology he adopts is more widespread than just this article. In fact, I suspect it is very widespread indeed, and as I said, if so, it explains many of the cumulative errors that we are seeing. Now, let me first of all begin by saying that this person, though he writes about Russian shell production and identifies various Russian factories that are involved in Russian shell production, and I say involved, they don't necessarily all produce shells, they produce some of the raw materials that go into making shells, like the explosives and things of that kind. Anyway, he identifies these factories, but he doesn't do what I suspect intelligence agencies once upon a time, in the classic era of intelligence gathering, which perhaps started intelligence gathering and analysis, which perhaps started, say, around 1940 and continued until, say, 1980 or 1990. Anyway, what they would have done, which is perhaps obtain photographs of these factories, look at the size of these factories, get a sense perhaps of the scale of these factories, try and work out the size of the labour force, get a sense of the skills of the labour force, get some information about the managers of these factories. We do know the names of the managers of all of these factories, but anyway, he doesn't look into the question of their biographies at all, which is, I think, a mistake, by the way, because the personalities of a factory's manager, the kind of personality the manager has, the extent of his connections, the degree of pull, the respect or lack of it that he has on the part of a workforce, is an important factor in how a particular factory performs. But anyway, I'll put all that aside. He doesn't look at the question of machine tools, of where those machine tools might have been accessed. He doesn't do any of these things. What he does instead is something quite different. He tries to guesstimate Russian artillery production on the basis of revenues, announced revenues of these factories, and drawn from, based upon his estimate of the cost in Russia of shells. Now, he has certain problems doing this. He has to admit that there's been no information about revenues from these factories since 2016, that's to say 7 years ago. And there's no information either about the cost of a shell in Russia since 2005. So at the risk of perhaps oversimplifying his argument, though I don't think I oversimplify it too much, he takes the cost of a shell in Russia in 2005, increases it according to the rate of inflation since 2005, guesstimates that the cost of a shell in Russia today would be 2 to 3 of a 152 millimeter shell in Russia today would be $2,000 to $3,000 per unit. Make certain guesses about revenue streams into these factories since 2016. Halves, as far as I can see, these revenue streams, because as he correctly says, these factories don't only make shells, they also make various other products, including civilian products. And he arrives at a figure of just over 3 million shells for the production of shells by Russia in the period from 2014. And he suggests that it will be very, very difficult indeed for the Russians to replenish their stocks of the shells that they have used. He suspects that the Russians are, on the basis of these calculations, unable to keep up with production of shells, the shell production that they're expending, that they're depleting their stocks. And he comes up with some really very remarkable figures based on these calculated costs that he has of what it would cost the Russians to replace the shells that they have already used. He estimates that the cost to the Russians of replenishing the current cost of the main artillery and multiple launch rocket system ammunition this year would come to around $46 billion just to replace what the Russians have already used. That would require producing up to 1.8 million tons of such ammunition. And that he then goes on to say that in order to reproduce the entire range of ammunition that the Russians have used since the start of active hostilities in Ukraine would exceed $92 billion. Now, just for the sake of comparison, and this is just as a way of illustrating what I think is the fantastic nature of these claims, the entire worldwide market for machine tools in 2014, its value came to $81 billion. So that's obviously 2014. No doubt it would cost, its value is a bit higher today, allowing for inflation, though I suspect not very much higher. But apparently for the Russians to replace all the shells and equipment that they've used over the course of this war, since the start of this war, would cost them what I suspect is roughly the same as the entire worldwide market, global market for machine tools in any one year. Is this remotely realistic? Well, I'm going to say straight away that I think it is not just not realistic, I think it is fantastic. I think it is based on obvious errors in methodology. Let us first of all begin with his base figure, which is he takes the cost of ammunition in 2005 and uplifts it to take into account inflation. But firstly, one very obvious point, which is that the more of something you produce, the more the unit cost of it falls. Now, this is a well-known fact to anybody who's involved in industrial processes. But if you've set up and established a successful production line, if you set up your suppliers well, then if you're able to produce large quantities of a particular relatively simple item, and a shell or a rocket of a multiple launch system are relatively simple items, then the more you make of them, the more the downward pressure on unit costs would tend to be. In fact, it would be very extraordinary indeed if it were otherwise. It would suggest certain very serious problems in the industrial and supply system if, on the contrary, instead of unit costs falling with production volumes growing, unit costs were to rise. We've seen recently that in the European Union, the cost of producing a shell has increased by 20% to, we're told by the Financial Times, €850 per 150 millimeter shell. And that's because huge orders for shells are running into major capacity constraints. This is a blip. But this gentleman is assuming that this problem presumably continues throughout the entire period since 2014 and beyond. And he doesn't seem to me to be making any allowance for the possibility, at least the possibility, that the unit cost of shells is actually falling in Russia as production volumes have been increasing. And then there's another major problem, which is the 2005 base point, because 2005, which is the last year he has for the cost of a shell in Russia, 2005 was, in terms of Russian economic history, an entirely different age. First of all, we're talking about 18 years ago. And, well, so much has happened in the Russian economy since 2005. Now, in 2005, Russia was still recovering from the 1998 financial crisis, when the ruble collapsed, the banking system collapsed. It looked for a time as if the entire economy was going to collapse. In fact, there was a revival, but in 2005, that event was still just below the past horizon. And then, of course, in 2008, the financial crisis struck, and the Russian economy came within measurable distance of collapsing all over again. As I very well remember, there was massive capital outflow. The stock market, the two stock markets, Russia has two, both imploded. The government had to run through its reserves to plug all the gaps. But already there were signs of major differences since 1998, which is that the reserves in the event proved big enough. The financial buffers were strong enough to absorb the losses, and the economy just about pulled through. Then, after 2008, we had the second crisis in 2014, an artificially induced crisis, the result of Western sanctions, and also, of course, in 2014, in the fall of 2014, there was a very, very significant fall in oil prices. And again, there was widespread predictions this time that the economy would collapse, but in fact, it didn't do so. A sign of how far and fast the economy was developing. There was a recession in 2015, but it was relatively minor. The contraction, as I recall, was 2.2%, which is a contraction, but certainly not anything remotely comparable to the collapse of 1998. And there was higher inflation. From recollection, it came to something like 12% over the entire year. But again, this was relatively less, much less, than what happened in the 1998 crisis and what nearly happened in the 2008 crisis. Of course, in 1998, Russia seemed for a time on the tip of an actual descent into hyperinflation. And of course, there's been further progress since 2014, as we have seen over the course of the last year, because the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in February of last year were far more extensive than those which were imposed in 2014. But they've had actually less effect. The GDP contraction has been smaller, just 2.1%. Inflation has been lower. The recovery in both production and in the fall in inflation has been faster, and we are hearing lots of reports about an industrial recovery. Anyway, in summary, we simply cannot compare cost structures, the situation in the economy in 2005 in Russia, to the situation in the economy in Russia today. They are, as I said, different universes. And we have to also take into account that the situation with military procurement in Russia in 2005 was completely different from what it is today. In 2005, Russia, still recovering from the 1998 crisis, the horror of the 1990s was still very close. Military production in Russia in the 1990s had come to a complete standstill. By 2005, it had barely recovered. And I don't have the exact figures for artillery shell production in Russia in 2005, but I think it's a plausible guess that it was very, very low. In which case, unit costs of artillery shells in 2005 would be very, very high. Now, in saying all of this, let me repeat again that I don't have the figures, the up-to-date figures, but neither does the author of this article. He admits that there are no figures published post-2016. So he's just guessing on figures that precede 2016, and which in the case of unit costs per shell, he has to go back all the way to 2005 to get them, despite the fact, as I said, that the situation in that year is profoundly different from what it has been since. I am going to say straight away that if unit cost of production in the European Union of 155mm artillery shells was around, let's say, 600 euros before the start of the conflict, it's most likely going to have been less in Russia. I don't know that for a fact, but I personally would be very surprised if it were not so. In which case, his assumption that the cost of making shells is $2,000 to $3,000 per unit clearly is wrong by orders of magnitude. In which case, it's highly likely, and I stress again, highly likely, because I do not know the figures. I don't have the figures, but neither does he. I don't know the figures, but it's highly likely the production of shells has been much higher over both the period that he is looking back at and would be in the future and is in the present than he imagines. And as I said, the idea that the cost of replenishing all this equipment that's been used over the course of this war, the munitions that have been used over the course of this war, not just the artillery shells, but everything else, that it comes to the entire global value, probably, or not far off the entire global value of the worldwide market for machine tools. I mean, I think that is fantastic. Now, I am not going to fall into the trap of giving my own numbers for Russian shell production, because I don't know what the numbers for shell production in Russia are. I don't know what they are now. I don't know what they were before the war. All I am saying is you cannot use the methodology that he has done in order to try and arrive at any kind of estimate at what it is. I don't think that this methodology works. There are ways of calculating it, and I've discussed at the start of this program how that could be done. You get pictures of the factory, satellite pictures of the factory especially. You get a sense of the size of the factory. You get a sense of the quantity of machine tools that are operated there. If you are able to do the research, you're able to track down the contracts. This kind of thing is usually available now on the internet. You can probably find a sense of how many orders for machine tools these various factories have placed over the last 20-year period. If you get a sense of the size of the labour force, the size of the potential mobilised labour force. And as I said, get a sense of the personality of the manager, his connections, and of the quality of his management team, then I think you could probably get a pretty accurate picture of what artillery production, shell production in Russia is. Once upon a time, to my knowledge, intelligence agencies in the West did exactly that. I can remember an old friend of mine, long since passed away, who was an engineer and who was involved in building the Mulberry Bridges that had been used in the D-Day operation in World War II. And he described to me a lot about the process at that time and the way in which intelligence was gathered. And I'm sure this was refined to a much greater extent during the Cold War. And he told me how close the approximations of production by any particular factory were at that time to its real output. Well, I think it can certainly be done, but it would require a large team of people to do it. It would require a huge amount of observation, searching of the internet to get all of the open access information that would enable you to build up the picture. It would require advice from experts in the industry, the engineers, the explosives experts, all of those sort of people. They do exist, they can do it, can be done. I'm sure once upon a time it was done. But this is certainly not the way I would suggest doing it. And I suspect, I think it is highly likely, however, that the methodology which has been used by this particular individual probably is not that different to the way this is done or purportedly done by intelligence agencies today. We're so absorbed with cost issues, cost factors, that we tend to look at pricing and costs and take very arbitrary figures to calculate them, rather than looking at the actual industrial capacities and production processes that would enable us to make a much more accurate, gain a much more accurate picture of what is really going on. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this. As I said, I'm not going to guess my own figure of Russian shell production. All I'm going to say is I'm pretty sure it's a lot higher than this person imagines. Now, let me now turn to the Chinese-Russian summit, which has just taken place a few minutes ago, just as I was preparing to start this program. I saw pictures of Xi Jinping and his delegation at Vnukovo Airport, preparing to board their plane to fly back to Beijing. Now, this has been a massive series of meetings. There's been all kinds of agreements, promises, all sorts of things. The most important thing to understand about this is that this meeting was not about Ukraine. It was not about the war in Ukraine. It was not about any supposed Chinese peace plan to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman, the Kremlin spokesman, has actually said that when Putin and Xi Jinping met, they discussed general principles about how peace might be achieved in Ukraine, but there was no discussion of any peace plan, and that's unsurprising because no peace plan devised by China, in fact, exists. This obsessive focus that the United States and the Western media have engaged in talking about a Chinese peace plan, which, as I said, does not exist. Well, whether intentionally or not, what it has done is that it's distracted attention from the real business of the summit meeting. Now, what is that real business? Well, it seems to me that there are two elements to it, and I've noticed that the Chinese and Russian governments have published two joint statements. I haven't read them, and I don't want to discuss them in detail when I haven't actually read those statements, because I haven't yet been able to find official transcripts. I'm sure that the two governments will be providing these transcripts within the next 24 hours, and I intend to return to them, to these issues then. But briefly, it seems to me that what the Chinese came for when they went to Russia were promises from the Russians that the Russians would in future guarantee energy supplies to China. And they got them. The reason is that the Chinese are very, very worried about energy, supplies of energy, and indeed other raw materials and food from the Russians, generally, because the Chinese are worried that in the event that they find themselves in a conflict in the United States will try to use its navy and its abilities still to control movements of raw materials to try to effectively impose a blockade on China. I should say that way back in the last years of Obama's time as US president, I was already reading in the US media talk about plans by the US Navy to impose a naval blockade of China by closing the Straits of Malacca. I have to say, I thought it crazy then. I still think it crazy today. It seemed to me an act of open warfare, in effect, against China. But anyway, it's what the United States seems to be edging towards. We're much closer to that sort of thing being done today. So the Chinese are going to the Russians, asking the Russians to cover their backs to ensure that in future China is able to access the raw materials, the oil, the gas, the food, the strategic minerals, all of those things which Russia has in abundance, in case we ever do get a situation where the United States recklessly and irresponsibly seeks to impose that kind of blockade on China. And in return, there was also some kind of a political declaration. And I want to stress again, I don't have the actual texts of any agreement, but I found on TASS, along with, huge number of comments about all sorts of other complex intergovernmental agreements, about the use of the Chinese currency by the Russians in foreign trade with third countries, which is very interesting, by the way, and as a topic, no doubt we will come back to soon. Also, about cooperating on space developments, about developing the Northern Sea route, about developing AI technologies, all that sort of thing. But I saw, amongst all of that, this dispatch on TASS. And it reads, this is the TASS report, and it reads as follows. Russia, China set to defend, note the word defend, each other's core interests, joint statement. And then the report, the dispatch from TASS is very brief. Moscow and Beijing will help each other to defend their core interests, such as territorial integrity and security, the two nations said in a joint statement published by the Kremlin on Tuesday. According to the document, Russia and China are proposed to provide, and now it's quoting directly, to provide resolute mutual support with regard to matters of defending each other's core interests, primarily sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, and development. Now, that is an announcement of a military alliance. Just. It's not quite that, but we're almost there, because each country now agrees that they will provide mutual support with regards to matters of defending each other's core interests. It's not saying that one country will come automatically to the other's defense, but it says that each country will provide resolute mutual support to the other on matters of defending each other's core interests. It's just one step away from a public announcement of a mutual defence pact. We might not get to a straightforward mutual defence pact, but this comes extremely close to it. And what does it cover? It covers things like sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, and development. Note territorial integrity. So Russia is now committed to providing resolute support to China in terms of protecting its territorial integrity. In other words, protecting its rights over Taiwan. And I'm not saying that Taiwan is the core of this agreement, because the Chinese have entered into similar obligations to the Russians. I haven't seen the part of the joint statement that refers to Ukraine. I haven't actually seen the exact text, but commentaries that I've seen about it and what claim to be reproductions of it that I've seen from various publications which are not directly connected to those governments, it seems to me leave open the question of Ukraine's territorial integrity, as, by the way, did the 12 points, the definition of Ukraine's territorial integrity, which, by the way, that position paper the Chinese published some weeks ago with its 12 points also did. So I'm not saying that the Chinese are going to rush to recognize formally that Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk are parts of Russia. But again, perhaps we're getting close to the point where if the Russians feel threatened in these territories, given that the Russians see that as a core interest, the Chinese will provide them with resolute mutual support in matters of defending the core interest, which is Russia's protection of these territories. So, as I said, not quite a mutual defence pact, not quite the open declaration of an alliance, but we're just one step now from that point. Maybe a step which these two countries decide in their own interests it's not necessary for them to go to. But there it is. Now, how are they going to provide each other with mutual help? Well, as I said, in the case of the Russians, they could provide oil, gas, food, strategic minerals, certain types of military technology. They've done so in the past. They might do so again. Let's talk about China and what it might do, for example, in the context of this war that the Russians are fighting in Ukraine. There's been a huge amount of discussion about Chinese arms supplies to Ukraine, to Russia. We see no real evidence of this at the moment, and I don't think it's going to happen, actually. I've come round to the view that it isn't going to happen. But that doesn't mean that China can't supply lots of things that the Russians might need. Let's go back to that article about shell production. Let's say, for example, that the Russians need to redeploy skilled workers to these factories in order to increase production of shells. Well, China has tens of millions of skilled workers. So, by the way, do other Russian allies, like, say, North Korea, Vietnam. You could have situations where the Russians redeploy some of these skilled workers from other Russian factories to the factories involved in arms production, and the Chinese replace those workers with other workers on some kind of contract basis. Not impossible, not the sort of thing we do in the West, but the kind of thing that countries like Russia, China have done in the past and might do again. It's not outside their experience. And then, of course, we've seen that there are always supply issues. This is the key point. Let's say that in producing shells, for example, the Russians need nitrocellulose. And China is the biggest industrial power in the world. It can probably supply that in the necessary quantities that Russia needs, and it can probably be done in a way that really isn't visible in terms of sanctions. On the question of visibility, I noticed that the Russian central bank has now prohibited Russian banks from using SWIFT for internal financial transactions. In other words, financial transactions within Russia. So that the whole movement of money inside Russia has now become essentially invisible to the United States. So you can see how this could work. And of course, China can also do all kinds of things with shipping oil. There's lots of reports at the moment about how there's more oil in the markets than there ought to be, and more oil reaching Europe than there ought to be, which must mean that some Russian oil is getting to Europe. No doubt there is, and absolutely certain that there is. And, one can see how a lot of that could be done. The point to understand is that it's not just the Russian economy as a whole that now has the backstop behind it of the world's biggest manufacturing economy by far. It's Russian military industries as well. They don't need to import shells or tanks or other machines like that from China. They don't probably even need to import, say, drones from China. But they would be able to import all kinds of other equipment, other supplies, which would make it easier for the Russians to set up quickly their own production lines and to deal with any shortages that might arise, be it in labour, raw materials, specific technologies, or other things. And it is likely that this could all happen under the radar. Very difficult for the United States to track, probably all but impossible for the United States to track. And that's probably happening already, and it's probably going to happen steadily to an even more extensive degree. So, a convergence of these two great powers, enormous implications for the future, important implications for the here and now. But as I said, I'm going to come back to this topic soon, as soon as I get more information from the two governments as to the exact texts of the statements that they've issued, these two joint statements that they've issued, and that will have to be in my next video. So this is where I stop. More from me, as I said again, soon. Just remains for me to wish you a very good day, and also to remind you that you can find all our videos, all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. That you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, which you will also find links to under this video, with its amazing range of merchandise, its mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.